Hello everybody, this is the first video lecture that we're going to have for our course. And it might differ in terms of which chapter we're doing. Sometimes I might present a PowerPoint, but other times I'm going to just sort of use the book chapter to outline certain things. I'm not going to read the book to you because that doesn't make any sense, correct? But I'm going to highlight some major issues and to maybe supplement some of the chapter's material. And so what I'll do for this particular chapter, chapter 1, it says 2 for here, which is maybe a little bit confusing, but here we're in chapter 1, uh, which is highlighted as Roman numeral 2 here. So just the numbering system is a little bit strange, but this is chapter 1. So we're going to, in chapter 1, essentially review what lifespan psychology is and also look at various issues here. So it talks about various learning outcomes in the chapter. And where I think the chapter does a decent job, I'll just sort of let the chapter do it, the textbook do it. But again, I want to highlight certain things. And also, part of what I can do is highlight what are some of the more important things to know, and also what are some of the least important things to know in relevance to things like your exam. And so, basically, lifespan psychology goes throughout the whole life. That's what obviously it means. So we're going to go from prenatal development to death and dying, and we'll talk more about that. And in terms of development, so we look at ways that people develop over the lifespan. And so a lot of times we look at how people change. And so here the book talks about describing change and explaining change. So sometimes the describing change is just noting how people differ in a certain thing as they get older. Explaining the changes is a lot more theoretical and also deals with research. And so the describing change is relatively easy. We can observe that pretty easily. But the explanation about how and why people develop the way they do is much more complex. And we'll see that there's various theories that have different explanation for explaining these changes. And that we'll do in chapter number 2. And so go ahead and read the chapter. Again, I'm not going to read this to you. I'm just looking for highlighting of things here. And we'll talk about possible careers in human development. So this thing about who studies human development, many people do. So it lists many different fields. And probably some of you are coming from these fields. Some of you might be coming from the healthcare field. So I'm going to highlight where I'm talking about this. So some of you might be in healthcare fields like nursing. Some of you might be into nutritional sciences. I haven't met with you yet, but in my general psych classes and my biological psych class this semester, there's many people who, I shouldn't say many, but there's been a handful at least of people who said they're in nutritional sciences. Child development, obviously. So we have an early childhood development program here, and so people who are taking that program obviously are studying development too. Biology, obviously, there's some biological models of development over time. Sociology, psychology, gerontology is the study of aging. And gerontology is actually a growing field because we have a growing aging population in the United States. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about careers and future possible career pathways or educational pathways that relate to what we talk about in class. And there's some references here you can look at. I'm going to go to the next section, chapter 1. So here, cohort effect. So basically, I'll just sort of highlight what this is. So a cohort effect. So a cohort is like a group of people who are basically the same age. And so they're not scientific terms, but things like terms like millennials and Gen X, Gen Z, all of these things are referring to a cohort. And with terms like that we use in everyday language, the assumption is that people who are essentially born and grow up during a certain time period share some sort of experiences that make them different from other generations. And so in development, we have to be very careful in how we study development because we don't want to have cohort effects because those are historical changes. It is interesting to see how history changes development, but we need to be careful because we might be studying something and we see changes and we think, oh, it's because of development, but in reality, it's because of some social, cultural, historical events that that cohort has experienced. And so, the ways that we study developmental psychology, we need to make sure that the changes we see in people are due to developmental processes and not due to social, cultural, historical processes or events. So that's a challenge in developmental psychology. And we'll talk about some of the methodologies we use to sort of tease those things apart. I'm going to make the text a little bit bigger. So this part of the first chapter just basically talks about social economic status and how that affects development. So, definitely read that. And that's something that we can talk about too. Um, that's been studied, but I think it's something that we can emphasize more in our discussions of developmental psychology. And you can read these models of defining different strata in the social classes. So go ahead and read this. I'm not going to read it to you. You can read the textbook, obviously. And so it gets into some consequences of social class, including poverty. So please read that. And some of you might maybe research some of this. And so in terms of our class, we're going to be doing that community needs research project. And maybe some of you will look at maybe people who uh, are in the lower social classes, meaning that they don't make as much money. They're in poverty, and how certain programs can help address risk and issues and needs for people in that population. I grew up in that population, by the way. I grew up poor. Food stamps all the time, welfare, sometimes government housing. So when I say those folks, I am those folks also. Um, and the one thing we know about being poor, it's not just about money. When you're poor, it affects all certain systems, and you can see here, you know, healthcare, um, in terms of infant mortality rates, prenatal care, nutrition, um, schooling. So when you are in poverty, it's not just about money, it's about multiple things that can affect multiple aspects of development. I don't need this tool, at least maybe until very recently. I can say that I was very poor, so I don't need that tool. But if you want to use that tool, you can try it out. And then obviously culture impacts development also. And so you can read this little part of the chapter here about culture. One of the things that we'll try to do in our live class when we meet in person is to have more interaction. And one of the things I want to do in our interactions is to talk about our different experiences in different cultures. Whether those cultures are outside of the United States or within the United States. Within the United States, there's also multiple cultures. And I would like us to sort of talk about our observations about how culture affects various aspects of development. And I'll try to share what I can too, because I've lived overseas. I've lived in Singapore and Hong Kong and made some observations about how culture impacts development. And so we will discuss this. And I hope that you'll share your insights from your experiences with different cultures. And then essentially, excuse me, uh, this is the structure of our book, and we're actually going to cover it this way. So the way that we're going to do this class is we're going to do it through ages. And so we're going to go from prenatal, so conception until your birth, and through death and dying. And so these are different stages of development or periods of development. So one reason to do that is it allows us to connect the different domains of development. So when we say domains of development, we mean things like cognitive, so how people think. Obviously infants think differently from kids who are in early childhood, and they think differently from adolescents. And so our thinking develops over time. So that's one domain. Physical development is another domain. Social development is another domain. And we have also the domain of emotional development, which also includes things like development about the self, how you think about yourself and feel about yourself. And so what we'll do is at each age, we'll try to connect those parts. We'll try to connect the physical, the cognitive, the social, and the emotional aspects of development because they really are in many ways connected and integrated. And the best way to integrate them is to see how that's so kind of co-occurring and co-developing as the person develops through life. And so that's the way that we're going to structure this class. And you can read a little bit about this. It just gives you the rough guidelines about the definitions of each of those stages of life or periods of development. And you can read those things right here. And of course, we'll define them more specifically as we talk about them throughout the semester. Okay, next we're going to talk about research methods. And so research methods covers a lot of different things, obviously. And so we'll look at research methods kind of in general for psychology. And this class actually doesn't have prerequisites. So there's no assumption that you've had general psychology or research methods or anything like that. And so I'm going to assume that you don't know about psychological methods. If you know about psychological methods, some of this might be a repeat, but you can sort of go fast through this video if it is a repeat for you. And then we'll talk a little bit about some special methods, particular for studying development. So we'll start off general, and then we'll go to more some specific designs that we use for development. So here we're talking about personal knowledge versus scientific method. And so one of the big points about this is when you teach psychology, this is something that can come up. It doesn't come up as often as one might think, but once in a while, and I think it was probably more in the older days, if you will, you might be teaching something, and you might say, okay, here's how development basically happens for people, and then somebody will say, my cousin is that age and they don't do that, and so that doesn't make any sense, what you just said. That's personal knowledge. And when we do research and we talk about these patterns, they're general patterns. It doesn't mean every single person is the same. And so personal knowledge is that kind of like, my cousin does this. What I would like us to do in this class is to be able to connect the academic knowledge about development with our observations of everyday behavior, everyday development. And so I hope that there is a connection in this class that develops in terms of the scientific knowledge that we gain about development from this class and things that you observe in real life. So it does have that personal meaning, but it's not some sort of personal opinion that's not based on anything except some rough observation that's not systematic. And so you can read a little bit more about that. This is kind of like personal knowledge is almost like what we call pseudoscience. It's not really systematic or scientific or done with care. So it's a bit more like pseudoscience. Psychology, including developmental psychology, is a science. So we rely on the scientific method. You can read about the scientific process here. You probably know it already, but you can read it here, including this. So that's kind of another model. These models are basically the same models. It's just that they use different language to talk about that. And then we'll talk about these types of studies in a second here. In fact, I think I'm going to finish this page. I do have to go check my laundry, and I'll pause this video while I'll check the laundry. So I'll finish this page so I know exactly where I left off. And so remember that earlier we talked about two goals of uh, developmental science is to describe changes over time, so to describe development. And another goal was to explain development. So this is kind of what it's saying here. Descriptive studies are to describe something. So it just describes what is seen. And it should be, I wish they had developmental questions here. So you could have, in what ways do adolescents think differently than kids in late childhood or middle childhood? That would be an example of a developmental question. Or how do infants differ from toddlers in terms of how they think about things? And so that would be descriptive, is to describe the changes over time in some domain, like thinking, cognitive development. Explanatory studies are trying to explain development, explain those changes. And so once we kind of know how infants and toddlers, for example, differ in how they think, we can do some explanatory studies to see if our theories that explain those changes over time, whether there's evidence for those theories. So what I'll say is we kind of need both of these studies, but the explanatory studies are much more important because you could spend all day describing changes over time, but if we don't know why those changes happen, it doesn't really matter that we know that they changed. Uh, that doesn't help us much. We have to know about how we can help people. So one of the things that your uh, community needs research paper is going to do is to really talk about these why questions. So if I think, for example, I want to focus in on helping adolescents have more pro-social development, have more positive development, I need a theory. I need a theory that's based in research to explain, well, what are some things that promote positive development for adolescents? I can't design a program. I can't talk about what things I could do to help people if I don't have a theory, if I don't have an idea about how I can affect people. So explanatory studies are much more important. Evaluation research is quite simple. They have examples here. Evaluation research is you're basically examining some sort of program or intervention to see if it has an effect on people. So for example, if I'm doing that promoting positive development in adolescents, and I have a program that's supposed to produce that, I better evaluate that program. Am I actually producing those changes in adolescence that I think I'm having? So evaluation research is really important because we're spending a lot of time and money in programs, and we want to have some evidence that those programs are effective. So that's what evaluation research is. And what I'll say is evaluation research should really be tied to a body of explanatory studies, because you can't design a program without understanding how you can affect people and help them, and why changes occur with people. So these kind of go hand in hand. I would say any evaluation program or research that you do that doesn't have explanations about what's going on is going to be useless. Even if you produce change, you don't know why. You have no idea how you did it. It might just be dumb luck. So we want to be systematic. We want to say, okay, this is how we affected people. This is how we produce change. This is how we help people. So those are three broad categories of developmental research. And also, I'd say general research in psychology too. And we'll get into more about the research methods part. Um, and actually, I think I should talk a little bit more about it right now, because this video actually kind of illustrates some research methods. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into this real quickly, and it should be discussed in the book later too. So I want to make this bold. I'll make this bigger so people can see. So what we were just talking about just now, we can use it in developmental psychology, but we also use it just sort of in general in psychology. But let's talk about some specific methods that are used just for developmental psychology, because we're going to be looking at how people change with age, with those periods of development that we talked about. So one basic method is called cross-sectional. And in cross-sectional, what we do is we just take different groups of people and their different ages. And we compare those groups of people. And if those groups of people differ on whatever we're looking at, whatever domain we're looking at, then we can sort of propose that perhaps those differences are due to development. So for example, if I'm just going to take a very rough thing here. Let's say we look at 6-year-olds. We have a group of 6-year-olds. We have a group of, let's say, 12-year-olds, and then we have a group of, let's say, 18-year-olds. So we have three groups of people. There's 6-year-olds, there's 12-year-olds, and there's 18-year-olds. So this is all at one time. So I could go to, I guess, a kindergarten and get a bunch of 6-year-olds. I can go into, maybe it's middle school for 12-year-olds, and I can go into a high school and get the 18-year-olds. So I'm getting different people at different ages. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare them on whatever I'm studying. You know, it could be thinking again, or maybe moral development. So various things, whatever you want to look at. And then again, that assumption is if these groups differ on the thing I'm looking at, we can say, oh, that's because of development. That 6-year-olds are different from 12-year-olds, and they're different from 18-year-olds. So the advantage of this method is that it's quick. If you are well organized, you could do this pretty fast. You know, you could almost literally do this within a week. You know, as long as you have to have your measures and all that other stuff compiled. But basically, you know, if you have a group of researchers, within a week, you could go to some school and get a bunch of 6-year-olds. Go to another school, get a bunch of 12-year-olds. Go to another school, get a bunch of 18-year-olds. It's very quick. So that's the big advantage. It's very quick. The problem is, and remember we talked about this before, there could be a cohort effect. And so if you sort of listen carefully, I use the word assumption. If the 6-year-olds differ from the 12-year-olds, differ from the 18-year-olds, there's an assumption that those differences are due to development. However, those differences might be due to a cohort effect. Maybe the 18-year-olds differ from the 12-year-olds simply because the 18-year-olds experience something different growing up than the 12-year-olds, or vice versa. So those differences between the groups could be due to some unique social historical events that they were exposed to. So there's various examples of what these events could be, but we have one that we're sort of still in the tail of. Hopefully it's the tail. Um, COVID. So, if you look at uh, groups of students, and let's say you're studying different groups of students, and you have a group of students that are like, let's say, 6-year-olds who are just going into school, and you're comparing them with 8-year-olds. And you say, oh my gosh, the 8-year-olds look so different from the 6-year-olds. Well, maybe it's because those 8-year-olds were actually exposed to the COVID world the first 2 years of their school, and that made their experience different. And it was that COVID related event that produced the differences in the groups, and it's not development. It's the exposure to some historical event. So that's the problem with the cross-sectional study, is that we don't know really if these differences are due to development, because there could be a cohort effect. So another longitudinal, it picks it up right away, way of studying development is called longitudinal. Here we take the same people and we follow them over time. So if we have the same research design as above, you find a group of 6-year-olds. You measure them on a bunch of stuff. If you're smart, have a bunch of different things you're going to look at. You wait for 6 years. You find them when they're 12. You measure a bunch of stuff. You wait for another 6 years. I didn't actually intentionally do the 6 years span. That just came out naturally for some reason. Wait another 6 years, and you find them and measure them when they're 18. So here, this design is stronger because if there's any cohort, or I'm sorry, if there's any social historical event or cohort effect, everybody's affected. So everybody's in the same boat. So if you see changes in this case within individuals, then we have a pretty good idea that's due to developmental processes and not due to some social historical events, because these same people have experienced the same stuff throughout their life. So if there was some social historical event that had sort of a similar effect on development, it would wash out here. It wouldn't show any differences between the ages because you're looking at the same people. So that's an advantage of the longitudinal study, is that we have better inferences, we have better ideas about development from this design. The disadvantage, so these are disadvantages here, it takes a really long time. So remember I said, if you're well organized, you could do a cross-sectional study of these ages within a week maybe, collect the data within a week. Here, bare minimum, collecting the data takes 12 years. The same ages covered as the cross-sectional, but it's going to take you 12 years. You have to wait. You have to wait for these people to age. So it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of resources. I'll just put money as resources. It takes a lot of time to be able to track people. People move. People die. I hate to say it that way, but people do die. People get incarcerated. So I have some background in longitudinal research. I worked on the Jack and Jean Block longitudinal study, which was conducted at Berkeley. And I believe the data is now housed at UC Davis with Phil Shaver. That's the last I heard about that. So it takes a lot of resources because you have to follow these people. So in the study that the Block and Block study, there was a couple people who ended up in prison. And so to get access to somebody in prison takes a lot of resources, takes more time. You have to track people, you have to make sure you can follow them because you don't want to lose them. So you have to keep up on their moves, all these things. So it takes a lot of money. There's also something called attrition. So you spend a lot of resources to track people because you don't want attrition. If I can spell it right, I'm going to put non-capital letters because it will be correct then. So attrition, which means people drop out of the study. If you do it well, most people would drop out because you simply can't find them, or they might die. And so in the longitudinal study that Jack and Jean Block had at UC Berkeley, they followed people. I think the last time I was involved in, I think they were 24. I think by the age of 24, I think there was a number of people who weren't in the study anymore because they had died. There was one person who was murdered, one person who committed suicide, and there might have been some other instances like that. So there's always going to be attrition in various ways, or people move and they didn't tell you that they moved. You have no idea where they are. You can't contact them, so you lose them. So some attrition is natural, but what you don't want is you don't want differential attrition. So what that means is that you don't want something that's systematic leading to people dropping out. So for example, we just talked about earlier in this chapter about the effect of social economic status or social economic class on development. So when you're doing a longitudinal study, you better hope that the people who are poorer, like me growing up in poverty, that you lose them more than the rich people, because that will affect your findings. Your people will be different. You won't have the full picture of development because your sample's changed. Maybe you selected a really diverse sample at age 6, but you find out that the people who are in poverty are dropping out more. So you're losing them. You can't study them. That can really affect the ability of the researchers to generalize their findings of the study. So attrition is also sort of a disadvantage, especially if it's differential attrition. You expect some attrition, but you don't want differential attrition. And then the final thing I'm going to talk about in terms of the research design, it's called cross-sequential. So this combines the two approaches. So what you do is you actually start off with the cross-sectional. So you'll have the 6 and the 12 and the 18-year-olds, and you'll do it cross-sectionally at first. So you start off with a cross-sectional, which is great because you can get data right away, right? The longitudinal study, you have to wait 12 years to get this data, or these data. In cross-sequential, you do a cross-sectional study first. You can have data right away. But you don't stop there. What you do is, since we're doing 6 years here, you follow the same people. So the next stage would be your 6-year-olds are now 12-year-olds. Your 12-year-olds are now 18. And if you're good, you would actually follow your 18-year-olds and see what they look like when they're 24. So you start doing, sorry about this, you start doing longitudinal designs. And it's kind of nice, this cross-sequential design, because now you have 3 different cohorts. There's this cohort, there's this cohort, and then there's this cohort. So if there's any cohort effects, you should be able to untease it also through this design. Because if development looks different for one group versus another group longitudinally, then you wonder, well, did something affect this because of some social historical event or events? So here you end up having essentially 3 samples of longitudinal research, and then you just continue. So you wait another 6 years, and now you have your longitudinal sample that you originally would love to have had, but now you have it. You have it here. Although you have it, you had data right away with the with the cross-sectional, but you have also longitudinal data, just like you did a longitudinal study. But what's kind of nice is now you have extra data. So you have this group here where you followed them from 12 to 24, and then you have this group here that you followed them from 18 to 32. So you get a ton of data out of this. So the advantage is it has the advantages of both designs. You have the advantage of quick data from the cross-sectional design that you start with here. And you have the advantage of the longitudinal study where you can actually look at how people change over time. You have this group of people, how do they change over time? This group of people, how do they change over time? This group of people, how do they change over time? There's a ton of data about this now. The disadvantage is this costs a lot of money. Because now instead of just having one sample of longitudinal research, we have 3 samples we have to follow. So this is a beautiful design because it's really elegant and gives you a lot of information, but it costs a lot of money. But what I'll say is that this has grown a lot over the last decade or two. You see a ton of cross-sequential research coming out. Part of it is that not in America, well, maybe a little bit in America, but other countries, New Zealand, European countries, they've made investments in this type of research because they know the value of this type of research. So there's been a real heavy investment by certain governments in this type of research to understand how people change over time and how we can help people have more positive development. So all of that was prefaced because I wanted to explain that going into this. So there's videos here. And so watch this video. This is a British documentary, 49 Up. You might have seen it in other versions. But basically what they do is they follow the same kids over time. They started as kids and then they follow them into their, so this is 49 Up, until they're 49. So the sort of middle age, middle adulthood. And one of the reasons why they do that documentary is to see the changes that happen over time. So if you see a kid, here it says 14, actually it's 7, because I remember they were younger than that. So when I was seeing 14, I was thinking that doesn't make sense to me. So they started when they were 7. So one of the things that's striking is if you see somebody at 7, are they the same when they're 49? This is what we call continuity. I'm going to get rid of all of this stuff from the design stuff. So if people kind of stay the same over time, it's called continuity. So if you watch those videos, and I don't know how long it is that they have it here, because the actual documentary is quite lengthy. I'm actually tempted to see how long this is. It's only 7 minutes. So you can actually watch the whole documentary if you want to. There's tens of hours, I think, of the documentary because they kept on following the kids as they grew up. So if you see a 7-year-old and in terms of their personality and how they express themselves and how they kind of generally see the world, if they're the same at age 7 and then 49, that's 42 years. If you see them and like, wow, they're basically the same person, that's continuity. Discontinuity is when you see change. If I can spell it right. I spelled it right, it looks like, or either it was a fast correction I didn't see. So discontinuity is changes over the lifespan. So if you see somebody, I'll go both directions. I'll start with the more negative one first. So let's say you see a kid, and I'll sort of use that age 7. You see a kid at age 7, you think, oh my gosh, they're going to be fantastic in life. You know, they're going to achieve so much. And you follow them up 42 years later, and it's like, whoa, what a disaster. What happened? They seemed so promising and they crashed. That's a discontinuity. You can also have discontinuity in the other direction, which is more positive. You can see a 7-year-old and you think, oh my gosh, this kid's in trouble. They have all these risk factors and they have all these sort of negative behaviors and negative ways of interacting with people. They're doomed. You know, they're not going to have a good life. And then you follow them up years later, let's say it's 49 again, and they're just like almost completely different people. Uh, they're just loving and caring, and everybody really appreciates them, and they're articulate, and they kind of have a lot of self insight. And you're thinking, wow, they look totally different than I would have predicted, seeing them at age 7. So in a video like that, in those documentaries, you'll see things like continuity and discontinuity. And we actually want to study that in change. And so when I talked about sort of these descriptive studies and explanatory studies, some of the assumptions that you just kind of look at how people change over their lifespan and you just kind of say, oh, this is what happened in this, you know, as a group, this is what happened and this is how people develop. For me, developmental psychology is really interesting because people have different pathways. Some people are continuous in their pathway. Other people have discontinuities. To me, that's really interesting. And so instead of just looking at a group of people and say, let's just talk about, describe, and explain just general average change over time, some of the more elegant developmental research identifies different groups of people, identifies people who are continuous, and asks the question why, what evidence, what things are affecting this continuity. And then you can identify people with discontinuities and look at them more specifically. What factors cause these discontinuities? So for me, developmental psychology is really interesting when we start looking at those different pathways that people have. So you might see some of these themes looking at that video. There's another video that follows. And here's a particular person, Neil. And so I think I remember him, but I won't say anything because I want you to watch the video about him. And what's really interesting is that in this documentary, and I hope they show enough of it that you get this appreciation, is they often will show you different ages of the same person. So you'll see in a relatively short period of time in the documentaries, the same people at 7, 14, etc., 40 to 49. And you can kind of see somebody in terms of their continuities and or discontinuities right there in front of your face in these documentaries. And so what I'll say is what's kind of nice about our textbook is there's also a lecture by I think this is the textbook author. So I'm giving kind of a lecture to supplement the textbook here. This author has a lecture right here you can watch that's, I think, maybe 20, 25 minutes long. And so I'm going to get rid of this logging in thing. So you can watch this. You can watch this, and there's also a transcription here. I would suggest that you could do that in conjuncture with the textbook. And given that this is a transcript, I will not talk much about this because this video talks about this stuff. That's the transcript. So I'm not going to deal with that, particularly because the video will cover it. And so I don't want to be redundant, too redundant. There'll be some redundancies, but I don't want to be too redundant in these discussions. There's a PowerPoint here of some notes of the presentation that was on the previous page, but what I'll warn you is that this is not free. If you go to Lumen Learning, it will ask you to do a free trial. And so it asks for a credit card. If you're really on top of it, you could do a free trial, download all of the slides for the different chapters, and then cancel your trial membership before they charge you. But you don't need to do that. I would recommend that you just take standard notes, but there is that option if you want to, but I don't want you to get trapped into forgetting that you have the trial and then you get charged, and then you forget you were charged and they keep on charging you every year. I would generally recommend that you don't need those things. But if you find that it helps you, you can try it out. But I'm not advocating it per se. And the rest of the chapter is just talking about discussion. And so it's probably good to sort of talk about this. So these are just thought questions. You do not need to do this for the class. So there's not going to be any assignment that does this. It's just a way of sort of provoking some thinking on your part. And then we have, this is chapter 2. So we'll talk about developmental theories in chapter 2. So that was an overview of chapter 1, me giving you some additional information. In addition to the textbook, do read the textbook and do watch the lecture that the author has made relevant to the textbook that will help you study throughout the rest of the textbook. So that's it for the first week. And then I'll make similar videos for every week, every chapter that we have from now on. And then if you have any questions about the material in the textbook, in the video lecture of the author, or the video lecture from me, you can always ask me through email, or you can ask in class also. So I'll see you in class, and I'll talk to you also in the video for next week.